likes of Thomas Aquinas, George Berkeley, and St. Anselm. Those who stand in opposition also have their own valid and convincing, thoughtfully worded points. Philosophers like Gilles Deleuze, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously, or perhaps infamously, declared the death of God. The rules for tonight's debate will follow a classical format. Each participant will have 20 minutes for their opening speeches, followed by a first rejoinder of 12 minutes and a second rejoinder of 10 minutes. Upon completion of the second rejoinder, we will pause for a 5-minute restroom break for the audience. And if at any time you need to use the restroom, there are exits here and back there. If you don't wish to come through these front doors, there are staircases following those exits back. The debate will recommence, with each debater having 7 minutes to cross-examine the other. The person asking the question owns the time and the questions, and I will ensure that that remains the case. Following the cross-examination, the debaters will have 5 minutes for closing arguments, where they will summarize the debate. Finally, we will have a period of Q&A for the audience. Here, we encourage you to ask a specific, precise question, providing no long lead-ins to the question. Be as specific as to whom your question is addressed, either Mr. Murphy or Mr. Meadows. If it is for both, please note that as well. The topic of the Christian God's existence is an important one, and obviously can be a highly emotional subject. To ensure that tonight's debate is constructed in the highest respect for both sides, we ask that all cell phones and electronic devices are silenced or turned off, and we also ask that there be no loud outbursts. Should anyone in the audience become ruly or fail to follow the rules of decorum, they will be promptly asked to leave the event. With that, let us give a round of applause for our participants tonight, Mr. Eric Murphy and Mr. Dean Meadows. As it is with any classical debate, the affirmative side will go first. So please welcome Mr. Dean Meadows. And Dean, when you begin speaking, I'll start the timer.
Tonight's question, does the Christian God exist, is a metaphysical question. It is a question about the fundamental nature of reality, or how the world actually is. Therefore, 2 questions arise on this basis. First, what evidence is there to validate the claim that the Christian God exists? And second, what evidence is there to invalidate the claim that the Christian God exists? Now, I'll leave it to Mr. Murphy in his opening speech to prove or provide evidence that invalidates the claim that the Christian God exists. Here, I'm going to provide 3 arguments which conclude that the God of Christianity exists. However, before I provide these reasons and arguments, I need to define terms and make some qualifications. First, by God of Christianity, I specifically mean the greatest possible being who has revealed himself in the character of Jesus Christ. Therefore, in tonight's debate, I will defend 2 major propositions. First, God exists, and second, Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave bodily shortly after being crucified. If these 2 things are true, then we have good grounds to believe that Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then it is true that the God of Christianity exists. Secondly, I'll be defending a mere Christianity, as C.S. Lewis defended. I will not be defending every theological doctrine or church council or debate or denomination or even every single author of the Bible. While these are good discussion topics, they're not required to answer tonight's proposition. With this in mind, I'll begin to give my 3 arguments for the existence of the Christian God. Argument number 1, the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument provides us with good philosophical and scientific grounds to believe that the universe is not past eternal and has a cause for its existence. The argument is as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Premise 3, Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Premise 4, that cause is God. And premise 5, therefore, God exists. Defense of premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 1 seems to be non-controversial, for out of nothing, nothing comes. The premise is rooted in the causal principle that states that things that begin to exist do not come into being uncaused from nothing. For nothing lacks all causal powers, because it has no properties at all. It is a linguistic device that denotes the utter lack of any essence, properties, qualities, or attributes. Hence, in our everyday experience and scientific observation, we have good reasons to believe that premise 1 is true. So now I'll go ahead and defend premise 2. The universe began to exist. One line of empirical evidence that points to the beginning of the universe is the second law of thermodynamics. In simple terms, this law states that in a closed system, in any closed system, it will eventually run out of usable energy. Applying this to the universe, this law states that the universe is slowly running out of usable energy and will eventually experience what scientists call a heat death. The universe will grow cold, dark, and void as the amount of energy in the universe becomes equally distributed. But this raises a significant problem for those who believe that the universe is past eternal. For if the universe has been slowly running out of energy for an infinite amount of time, why hasn't it already experienced heat death? Indeed, given an infinite past, the universe should have run out of energy an infinite amount of time ago. But this is clearly not true, for if it were, we wouldn't be here tonight. Therefore, the most plausible conclusion is that the universe is not infinitely old, but rather is finite in the past. If Mr. Murphy is to defeat this particular premise, he will have to show that the universe could be infinitely old yet escape the fate of already having reached heat death. But in absence of this, the second law of thermodynamics gives us good empirical support for the second premise of the Kalam, that the universe began to exist. Another scientific data point that supports that the universe had a beginning is what's called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. In 2003, Arvin Borde, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth were able to show that any universe, on average, that was expanding throughout its history cannot be infinitely old in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. And it holds independently of any physical description of the early universe, including pre-Big Bang cosmologies. Vilenkin states, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." However, it's not merely empirical evidence that supports the beginning of the universe. There are strong philosophical reasons for this as well. It can be shown that an infinite number of things cannot be causally prior to one thing. To do this, I'd like to introduce you to what's called the Grim Reaper paradox. Imagine a victim, Fred, who is assailed by an infinite number of unstoppable executioners, the Grim Reapers. Each Reaper is assigned a deadline between 11 p.m. and 12 midnight. And if any Reaper finds Fred alive as it is at its assigned deadline, it should kill Fred. However, if an earlier Reaper has already killed Fred, it does nothing. So, Reaper number 1 is assigned a deadline of midnight. He will kill Fred 60 minutes after 11 p.m. However, Reaper number 2 is assigned to kill Fred only 30 minutes after 11 p.m. Reaper number 3 is assigned to kill Fred only 15 minutes after 11 p.m., and so on to infinity. Now, to survive, Fred must escape an infinite number of Reapers assigned to kill him at an infinite number of deadlines, which is impossible. In other words, by midnight, Fred will be dead. But here's the critical question. Which Reaper killed Fred? Well, it wasn't Reaper number 1, because Reaper number 2 would have already killed him. And it wasn't Reaper number 2, because Reaper number 3 would have already killed him. And it wasn't Reaper number 3, well, you get the idea, onto infinity. So for any Reaper that you point to, he will have already killed Fred, because he would not have killed Fred because another Reaper would have already done the job. In other words, no Reaper kills Fred. But this gives us an explicit contradiction. On one hand, a Reaper will have killed Fred number of reapers, which allows the reaper with the earliest deadline to kill Fred. Therefore, an infinite number of prior causes leads to contradictions and should be rejected. Instead, in order to explain any state of affairs, such as Fred's death, there can only be a finite number of causes. And in conjunction with the first premise of the kalam, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence, this implies necessarily that the universe is not past eternal. Therefore, we have both empirical and philosophical reasons for thinking that the universe began to exist. Now, given that we have good reasons for premise number 1 and premise number 2 of the kalam, the conclusion that the universe has a cause necessarily follows. But what is the nature of the cause of the universe? Well, since nothing can cause itself, and the universe is all of space-time reality, the cause cannot be spatial or temporal. That is, it must be spaceless and timeless. But this rules out material cause as well, since matter both occupies space and time. Therefore, the cause must be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial thing. But the question is, why do we have any good reason to think that it's anything other than a personal being? Finally, there's good reason to think that the cause must be personal, since only things that could possibly meet the description are either abstract objects or an unembodied mind. And since abstract objects have no causal power to cause anything, the cause of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and must be an unembodied mind, which is the basic description of what most people mean when they say God. Argument number 2, the moral argument for God's existence. Now, it should be noted that in deploying the moral argument for God's existence, I am not arguing that one must believe in God to live a moral life, or that one can only recognize moral facts by believing in God. But the moral argument is a good argument for the existence of God. For our moral behaviors indicate that moral facts exist, and at least some of those moral facts function as moral laws. We know this by our own behavior, namely our moral failures. When we hear about the slaying of students at Sandy Hook, or the cowardice of the Uvalde Police Department, we are shocked because we believe that an objective moral wrong has been committed. It isn't that we merely prefer that kids not be killed while going to class. We believe that it ought never happen. It isn't that we merely prefer that police officers run to their aid. It's that when they don't, we believe that they have failed their moral obligation. Even in our own lives, we have moral obligations that we hold to be universally true, that when we fail to meet them, we feel the sting of that failure. All things being equal, when we're caught lying to our spouse, partner, or significant other, we feel guilty. But why? We believe that we have violated an objective moral law, that lying to our loved ones is wrong. So, our moral behavior indicates that moral facts exist, and our moral failures bring us face to face with the reality that these facts often function as moral laws. Second, moral anti-realism does not make sense of our moral experience. By moral anti-realism, I mean the view that says when it comes to moral propositions, there is no truth of the matter. Simply put, moral anti-realism posits that moral facts of any kind do not exist. Now, as an internal critique, take moral anti-realism as if it were true. Take something like moral disagreement, for example. If we assume that moral anti-realism is true, we would not expect to find moral disagreement, we would not expect moral disagreements to contain the following attributes. Number 1, productivity. By productivity, I simply mean progressing towards a particular resolution. Productive dialogue explicitly requires some kind of truth of the matter. We cannot make progress on a question that may not under any circumstance have a true answer. But if there are no moral facts ever, then there can be no progress. There is only where we happen to be. The moral anti-realist is like the man digging for buried treasure who plops the big red X wherever he happens to be and congratulates himself on finding the treasure. But there is no treasure. It doesn't exist. Likewise, the moral anti-realist may congratulate himself for holding some position on human dignity, but it's not a virtuous position. Moral virtue doesn't exist. So all moral anti-realists can say about any moral question is, well, I like X because, well, that's where I am. Number two, we wouldn't expect to find on moral anti-realism obligations. If moral anti-realism is true, then no one would have any obligation to change their mind in any moral disagreement. You might think that the Uvalde police officers were wrong not to engage the shooter, and someone else might think that they were right to not engage the shooter. On moral anti-realism, neither person is obligated to change their mind because there are no moral positions. Moral facts don't exist. However, if you think that we can make progress on moral disagreements, that a moral treasure does exist and we can find it, and if you think that people have an obligation to change their mind in certain moral disagreements, then you have good reason to think that moral facts exist. Finally, given these 2 points, we can conclude that the moral facts exist, the moral law exists, and this leads to the best explanation of these things is a moral lawgiver. We conclude, given these 2 points, we conclude that moral facts exist, and moral facts often function as moral laws, and the best explanation for that, the existence of moral laws, is the existence of a moral lawgiver, which has historically been called God. So here's the essential question for tonight's debate. Is Eric willing to commit to moral anti-realism tonight? Or will he offer some type of realist account of morality and find a more plausible justification than I have offered here tonight? Argument number 3, the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The third argument I'm going to offer tonight is that Jesus of Nazareth was raised bodily from the grave after being crucified during the time of Pontius Pilate between 30 and 33 AD. Now, in historical investigations, we want a hypothesis that provides the following. Explanatory scope. How many pieces of the evidence does the hypothesis account for? Explanatory power. What is the ease by which the hypothesis explains the facts? Is it less ad hoc? How many different, quote, add-ons must we create for our hypothesis to be true? And then we have plausibility. What is the degree by which our hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge? And illumination. Does the hypothesis explain or contribute to understanding other historical events that take place? With this groundwork laid, here are the facts that the majority of scholars agree with regards to the fate of Jesus Christ. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Shortly after that, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. 3, following his burial, his tomb was discovered empty by women and disciples. 4, his disciples believed that they saw Jesus risen from the grave. 5, there are early oral creeds that support Jesus' appearance to individuals and groups of people. 6, the disciples who are recorded to have been in hiding following Jesus' death, then openly preached that Jesus rose from the grave in Jerusalem. And 7, Paul, a persecutor of the church, becomes a Christian and joins the Christian community on the claim that he saw Jesus risen from the grave. Now, the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of these facts because it explains all of the pieces of the evidence. It explains each fact well without ambiguity or forcing the issue. It is less ad hoc because it only requires the additional hypothesis that God exists, which I've argued for here tonight. It is plausible because it's in accordance with other known facts or beliefs, and it illuminates or explains and contributes to other historical events that take place, like the rise of the early church. And so, in tonight's debate, if Eric is going to be successful in defeating these arguments, then he must raise his own arguments. He can't simply just sit back and go, nuh-uh. And so, if Eric cannot defeat these arguments and raise his own arguments as to why the Christian God does not exist, then the audience should take the affirmative and should consider not just taking the affirmative, but being a Christian. In conclusion, the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument, and the resurrection for Jesus Christ are good reasons that are more plausible than their negations to believe that the Christian God does exist. Thank you.
everybody. So before I get started, I have a couple of things, a little bit of housekeeping. It's very important. First off, I want to thank the Piedmont Church of Christ. I want to thank Longwood University and the event staff. I want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Mayberry. And of course, I want to thank Dean and all of you for coming. Without everyone that I just listed, I wouldn't be able to be here. And you wouldn't be here if you didn't think this was an important discussion to have. So, thank you for coming. Let's get into it. So, I have bullets. So we're going to go this way. Define the debate. Does the God of Christianity exist? That is what you need to know. That's what you're trying to figure out. That is the point of this debate. Okay? Sorry, I think it's just really silly. I just want to make sure that we're like on the same page here. If I proved that a God existed, but I don't know, maybe it was 4, would that work? No? What if it turned out to be Allah? Would I have won the debate for that? No. This is a debate about the Christian God, and I was really, really excited to be a part of this because I'm taking this a little bit better. Okay, I was really excited to join and really take part of this because you don't often see this part of the debate. Often atheists like me are so excited to talk about the large, overarching philosophical questions, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, teleological argument, you could name them. Those are all deistic arguments. That means that, you're arguing for a God, but who's to say that God didn't go out for a pack of smokes and never came home? That doesn't actually get us any closer to the Christian God. Stay with me if this is your first debate. I can't actually respond to Dean during this part. This is the intro. I wrote my intro, so I've got to stick with this. But just hold tight, we'll get that. Okay, so we need to zero in on the Christian stuff. If Dean decides that he wants to focus on not that, I really don't have much to do tonight because it's for specifically. How many times do I gotta say it, right? Okay. I feel like I was able to distill Christianity down to 3 words: be ready to be offended, and then sigh relief when I say salvation through Christ. I think that's at the heart of Christianity, because I was a Christian, right? I did believe that original sin was a thing, that we were all fallen, that Jesus needed to, be the sacrifice for our sins so that we could get to heaven. There's a whole lot more in there, but I think those are the core parts. That's what needs to be shown tonight, right? If any of those things don't work out, the debate has not been proven. It hasn't been shown. If somebody died for your sins, but it wasn't Jesus, then the Christian God doesn't exist. Not like that, not the way that you believe it. So I want to tell you a couple stories. Let's do it. If I can find it, I apologize. Nope. Don't have it. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. So, born of a virgin, born December 25th. Shepherds and magi witnessed and came and were a part of the scene, right? This person healed the sick. This person raised the dead. This person had 12 disciples. This person died, was put into a tomb, and then ascended to heaven afterward. I know, it's Mithra, right? Mithra's been around since, let me see, I actually have it written down, pre-200 BCE. So is that a trope that's been around as long as Christianity has? How about born a virgin, died a violent death? The body was ritualistically eaten as bread by worshipers, right? Eat this body, it is my flesh. Descended into the underworld, resurrected after 3 days. It's Addis. It's another one. Turns out that the trope that Jesus plays, it's not original. I'm not saying that doesn't make it true, but I am putting it into context. I think it's really important that we understand that at the time, people had heard these stories. It's been so long we have forgotten. And as a Christian, even if you don't agree with me on most of this, you have to know that we have forgotten most, right? We have let go of the context that most verses need to be understood. I can go on to Osiris, to Shiva, to Demeter, Dionysus. Of course, and the list just goes on. I'm not going to read them all. Suffice it to say that it's not original, but maybe it's true. Let's dive in. I think that if we're going to determine whether or not whether or not Jesus died for you, right? Salvation through Christ, we really need to be careful about our sources. It's important. So, what are our sources? Where do we get the story? Oh, we get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are generally what we point to when we want to learn about the birth, life, and death of Jesus, right? Yeah? Okay, how many Christians are in here? Okay, so do we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and go, yeah, no, there's the birth, life, and death of Christ? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Just making sure. You can't all be atheists. Okay. So how reliable are these folks? Let's start with, well, how old are they, first of all? Let's go with that. You do not need to take my word for it. If you have not dived into biblical scholarship, I highly suggest you do so. There are plenty of Christian scholars, and the majority opinion is Mark came first. Just, that's the way it is. Mark came first, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. That is the order. And if we look at them in that order, we see that the character of Jesus changes. And I guess that's fine, but we're supposed to be really depending on these texts to give us straight information, right? How many inerrantists are in the house? Inerrantists. That means the Bible is perfect from beginning to end. Not a jot nor tittle has been changed. Every piece. Okay, good. Then this is going to be important. Otherwise, I might just skip it. If there are parts of the Bible that disagree with themselves irreconcilably, can it still be inerrant? No. And yes, I am going over this because I feel like this is the core of the debate. Does the Christian God exist? So, we'll start with Mark. I want to break it up differently. I'm sorry. There's just so much to go. I had no idea which direction to go, and I kind of wrote it all down. So let's start at the beginning. Yeah, nativity story. Where do we get the nativity story? Is it in Mark? Yes or no? No, it is not. There is no nativity story in Mark. Nothing about Jesus' birth. What about Matthew? Yes, you get Bethlehem, you get the manger. Luke, they don't actually. Yeah, sorry. Luke, they live in Nazareth. That's embarrassing. Okay. Mark, nothing. Matthew, they don't get a manger because they live in Bethlehem already. Check your books. The wise men met them at their house, not in a manger. Matthew, yep, Luke, they lived in Nazareth, so they go to Bethlehem, yes, the manger. John, no Bethlehem birth at all. They just say that he's from Nazareth. Can all of those be in agreement? Can you live in there's no possible time that that could have happened and make sense with scriptures. It just doesn't work that way. How about driving out the money changers? When did Jesus drive out the money changers? The week before his crucifixion, if you're reading Mark, Matthew, and Luke. John drove out the money changers right at the beginning of his 3-year ministry. When did it happen? If you believe it is inerrant, that is important. If you don't, I guess it doesn't. But let's see, Garden of Gethsemane. And if you haven't figured this out, I'm pointing out where it doesn't no longer make sense. Right? It can't drive with itself. In the Garden of Gethsemane, let's see, Jesus is sorrowful unto death. Yeah, that's okay. The character of Jesus changes from as it gets older. Mark, the first gospel, writes Jesus as very meek and has the fewest miracles. You don't have the manger birth. You don't have being risen after death. You end at an empty tomb. And that makes sense. Sure, okay, first book, second book, builds up on it, right? You start to get the manger scene, you start to get the risen scene, but it builds and builds and builds. In the Garden of Gethsemane, where I was going with this, in the very first, meek Jesus, sorrowful unto death, and begs God, please take this cup from my hands. He brings 2 apostles with him. He gets mad at them, and they go. He asks God 3 times, by the way, take this cup from me. By the time we get to Luke, he doesn't bring his apostles. He goes by himself and says specifically, he's not sorrowful. And he says to God only once, please take this cup from my hands. John, Jesus is just buff, man. You guys don't even, Jesus takes it in stride. He says, why wouldn't I do this? Every step along the way, the character of John, the character of Jesus in John is a superhero. It was also the oldest book to be written. I do think that this is how fish tales can happen. You start small and over retelling, it grows and grows and grows. When you get to the crucifixion, the important part. In Mark, Jesus gets crucified. He says, God, why have you forsaken me? And then dies. In Matthew and Luke, it gets at him. He talks to the people on either side of him, right? He talks to the Roman soldiers while he's up on the cross. He's a little more awesome. He's not just crying and saying, why have I been forsaken, and dies. And John, badass Jesus, of course, he isn't just, he carries the cross himself, he cries out, they know not what they do. He's a superhero. We have to realize that in context, the character changes. So let's take it now to the resurrection. We see over time, from Mark to Matthew to Luke, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, that over time, it grows. If we want to look at original texts, maybe that'll save us. How old do you think the oldest text we have is? The oldest piece of Bible manuscript. It's P52 is what it's called. It's about this big. It's like the book of John, so it is the oldest book. It is the furthest from events out of all of them, and it has partial words on it. It only has one full word, the word "and." But sure, people say it's part of John. That's fine. How long does it take until we get full manuscripts? Let's see. So that P52 was 125 years later. I think we're around 300 years later until we start getting manuscripts, and that's not the entire Bible. individual books.
Excuse me, I can't hear you.
No?
You gotta speak louder, if you want to reach your audience.
Sure. What I wanted to spend most of this time on is really going over the New Testament, really trying to determine whether or not we can trust the narrative. Has it been long enough, right? Is it soon enough after events that it is recorded, and did we get it from good sources? Do we have first-hand sources? Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write those books? Did they? No, they did not. Those are anonymous. If you want to look into it, look into it. Don't take my word for it. Do some scholarship. I bet you would love that. Are we confident that it hasn't changed? We know it has changed. In several books, they even point out, geez, I think it's in Luke, the very book itself begins with, this is information that was passed down to me. It was not a first-hand account. So we have no first-hand accounts. Not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, not John. You can look into the Bible scholarship. We have a character of Jesus that changes. One from fewer miracles to more miracles. We have a crucifixion and resurrection that changes. It becomes more and more amazing as time goes on, just like you would expect a legend to be. That is how legends work. I'm not saying that a Jesus Christ never existed. That's weird, and I really don't care, honestly. I care about the magic part. I care about sacrificing yourself, or Jesus sacrificing himself for salvation for everybody. So, can we trust it? I don't think so. I think the evidence is clear that it's packed full of analogy, wild imagery. Along the way, people put in their own spins on things. The book of Mark was influenced partially by the Iliad, actually. Mark invented an entire sea. Thank you. Mark invented an entire sea because he wanted sea stuff going on, happening there. The Sea of Galilee, I believe. Right? You know. So the Sea of Galilee is a really, really tiny lake. You can hop in a rowboat, or at least you could, 1,500 years ago, and row across it in 2 hours. So why during the 10th hour on the 4th watch is there a massive storm? People are afraid that the boat is going to capsize. It just doesn't work out that way. When Jesus walks on water out to calm the seas, this lake doesn't have massive storms. It doesn't have massive waves that are going to capsize ships. It's just how it's the story Mark wanted to make. And well, there's another example. It's just doesn't follow with reality. You have people who are exaggerating things, and it just doesn't help. So,
Excuse me.
yeah, I don't think so.
Have they tested this?
You can hold on to that for questions. No worries. So I spent all of this time talking about this because I really honestly think that if you want to get to a deistic God, then how do you say about a deistic argument? Does a God exist? Not the point of this. Does your God exist? Does the Christian God exist? That's what the point of this is. And if we're not going to be talking about what's in the New Testament, we're not going to be talking about souls, we're not going to be talking about salvation through Christ, we're not having the debate. What is reasonable? We've got 7 seconds. You ready? What's reasonable is contextual. So take a look at how I got it. All right, 30. Cool. Did you make your thing stop? I got it. Context means everything. If you want to know who stole the cookie from the cookie jar, it's not really hard. You don't need to imagine that a ghost did it. You don't need to imagine that a leprechaun did it. The first thing you do is look for realistic possibilities, right? If said, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar? And I said, a unicorn with a Chicago accent. Well, I'd have a lot of explaining to do. And if you said, how is that possible? Unicorns don't exist. I'm saying, do you not believe the Chicago accent? People have Chicago accents. People steal things. It's the magic part. It's the resurrection part. It's the bodily ascent into heaven part. That's important. You need to have evidence that matches what's being said. When it comes to extraordinary claims, you need extraordinary evidence. So, that's that. Yeah. Here.
You get first response. You have the opening, and you got for first response. No, what do you want to do? I'll do it.
No, that's fine.
Okay. Oh, actually, no,
Yeah.
you're right. You're right.
Hey, if you want me to go, I can go.
I'll go. No worries.
Okay. I really want to just respond to the Kalam and the moral argument.
Okay, let's do it. Tell me what you want to do. And we're good. Let's see here. Got 12 minutes. Right here. Okay. Are you going to allow me to pull up my digital Bible?
Dave, would you like to borrow mine?
Sure.
Here you go.
The atheist brought his Bible and the Christian didn't. And I'm preaching tomorrow. Thank you for your good. All right, so I'll set the timer. Got 12, correct? Yes, sir. In my opening speech, I gave 3 reasons as to why the Christian God exists. The first reason was the Kalam cosmological argument that argued for the finitude of the past on the basis of scientific data and also philosophical reasoning. First, the second law of thermodynamics. Secondly, was the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, followed by a philosophical thought experiment known as the Grim Reaper paradox. My second argument was the moral argument, and I argued there that we believe that moral facts exist and that a moral law exists, and a moral lawgiver then is the best explanation for the moral phenomena that we experience, namely the times in which we fail in our moral behaviors. I also mentioned that moral anti-realism does not fit our moral experiences and therefore cannot adequately account for the moral phenomena that we experience as human beings. Finally, I argued for the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation for the consensus belief about the facts surrounding Jesus' fate. Now, I'm not here to defend those just yet. I'll do that after Eric responds, but just wanted to give that as a reminder. Now, in Eric's opening speech, he mentioned several things with regards to the Christian stuff. We need to talk about the Christian stuff. And he went off and he talked about things like the birth narrative. He talked about things that take place in Mark, about the Sea of Galilee. My argument tonight does not rest on inerrancy. There is and what Eric fails to realize here is that there is a massive difference between inerrancy and historical reliability. Furthermore, the Christian stuff is the central claim of Christianity, which is not whether or not the Sea of Galilee had big waves or no big waves. The central claim to Christianity is that Jesus rose from the grave after being buried, after being crucified by Pontius Pilate and buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. That is the central claim of Christianity. And if Eric wants to argue against the existence of the Christian God, it is that central claim that he needs to undercut. Not whether or not the Sea of Galilee had big waves or not. Not whether or not Jesus was born of a virgin. Not whether or not all of these other things that he's talked about. The central claim to Christianity is that Jesus rose from the grave bodily. 1 Corinthians 15 is that claim. 15 verse 3 through 15. Now, Eric tried to bring up some parallels to Jesus. He mentioned Apollonius of Tyana, he mentioned Mithra, he mentioned Attis, he mentioned Osiris, he mentioned Isis. Now, the interesting thing about Mithraism is that in Mithraism, and I don't know if Eric mentioned this or not, but this is a crucial point. The saving of the world is not through the sacrifice of Mithra, it's that Mithra kills a bull. That sounds nothing like what we see in the Gospels. Furthermore, Mithraism isn't even around until 150 AD. Jesus Christ walked the earth between 30 and 33 AD. And 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, is an early oral creed that many scholars date between 7 and 10 years after the fact. We also have creeds in Romans chapter 1 and Philippians chapter 2. We also have many songs that are mentioned, like in 1 Timothy chapter 4, that are early oral indications that the early church believed that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. And those are independent of the Gospels. They are much earlier than the Gospels. Furthermore, there's also, and I don't know if Eric wants to grant this or not, but what about all of the what scholars tend to believe or background information that other gospel authors use, like Q? Does Eric accept that? Now, I'm not saying whether I accept it or not. I'm just curious as to whether or not Eric will accept that as a source material for the gospel information. And if he does accept that, then that's another early independent attestation towards the Christian view and towards the resurrection. Furthermore, he talks about these differences that take place in the Gospels. What Eric may be missing here is that these differences are often reconciled by the purpose of each author. He says, well, in some of these Gospels there are a lot of miracles, in other of these Gospels there are not a lot of miracles. Well, could it be that one author wants to appeal to the Jewishness of Jesus, another author wants to appeal to the fact that the Gentiles have a place at Jesus' table, and another author wants to appeal to the fact that Jesus did miracles? If that's even possible, or if that's plausible, then Eric should abandon what he said as far as these differences. What I would like to ask Eric is, does Eric believe that all historical documents must be inerrant in order to be historically reliable? Is that the case? And what about conflicting viewpoints of a particular situation that takes place in history? For example, there were eyewitnesses to the sinking of the Titanic that said the Titanic broke in half. There were other eyewitnesses that said, no, it just sunk. Do we throw out the record about the Titanic just because there are conflicting differences with regards to what took place? Or what about an ancient source with regards to the burning of Rome by Nero? Tacitus says that Caesar was in the palace. Suetonius says that Caesar was out of town. And Cassius Dio says that Caesar was on the roof fiddling. Or that Nero was on the roof fiddling, playing a fiddle. Now, which one of those should we accept and which one of those should we reject? Or should we just say that Nero wasn't a real person and that Rome wasn't really burned? Which one is Eric going to apply for here? Also, he mentioned that these authors, I'll put it on the back here, that these authors of the Gospels were anonymous. So I'd like to ask the question of Eric, well then, does he throw out all ancient texts that don't have authors' names attached to them? Because if he's going to do that, then he's going to have to throw out Josephus, as Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews and Against Appian are both anonymous. Philo's biographies of Joseph, Abraham, and Moses are anonymous. Plutarch's 11 lives are anonymous. Historians like Livy and Tacitus leave all of their works, his histories, biographies, and anything else otherwise are anonymous. Suetonius' 12 Caesars are anonymous. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, yes, do not have names specifically attached to them in their earliest manuscripts. So is Eric going to be consistent tonight and throw out all of the major ancient Roman and Greek historians and biographers because their documents aren't anonymous? That is the claim that he made. They're anonymous, therefore it indicates that they're not as reliable. Is he willing to do that with other ancient Greco-Roman biographies that measure to the same time frame? Second, various methods were used to indicate authorship of documents, like tags which could be attached to scrolls, names written on the back of the scrolls, a running header, table of content, maybe a title page, or they were simply circulated into the communities that they were about, and everybody knew who did it. And so my question for Eric is, given that the earliest church traditions show or claim that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John, if those are not the authors, then what's the best case scenario for who actually wrote those? And if Eric can't produce a contender that's more plausible than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all of the historical evidence that points to those, then he should give up that argument. Finally, the other things that we need to understand with regards to that point, or I'll just reinforce this point, given that there's early attribution for the Gospels, and the unanimous agreement about the attribution and the uniformity of their titles, notice throughout all of history, with regards to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the only names that show up on the manuscripts are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is nobody else. The Gospels were known to have been, it seems very likely the Gospels were known to have been authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by some other means than personal identification within the main body of the text. But here's the point. Even if Eric is right about the anonymity of the Gospels, it does nothing or very little to show that Jesus did not rise from the grave. Notice in Eric's opening, he said that these accounts of the resurrection take specific turns, this, that, and the other. But what is the core data behind the resurrection? I've already mentioned the core data behind the resurrection. That Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that shortly after that, both women and his disciples found the tomb empty. Those disciples believed that they saw Jesus raised from the dead bodily, and in Jerusalem is where they were once hiding, and then they go out and they preach the gospel. We see also that Paul, who is an enemy of the gospel, becomes a Christian on the basis of the fact that he believed that he had an experience with the post-resurrected Jesus Christ. And also, when Eric talks about arguing for a deistic God, my only point in mentioning the Kalam and the moral argument is to provide the audience, whether they are Christian or non-Christian, a cumulative case for Christianity, and specifically the Christian God. Once again, my propositions are that God exists and that Jesus rose from the grave. And if God exists and Jesus rose from the grave, then Christianity is true, and therefore the Christian God exists. What Eric needs to do in his rebuttal, in his first rejoinder, is he needs to take those arguments and he needs to tear every single one of them down and provide good reasons why they shouldn't be trusted. And if he can't do that, then you should trust and take stock in the affirmative case for the Christian God, and you should also be, not just take stock in the Christian God, you should become a Christian tonight. Thank you very much.
All right, we're off to the races. We've got 12 minutes, so let's do this. I'm When it comes to the cosmological argument, it depends on a pretty simplistic understanding. Thank you. When it comes to the cosmological argument, it depends on a pretty simplistic view of science and an understanding of infinity to be even remotely convincing. Really, honestly. If you think that eternity can go forward forever, then why couldn't it go backward forever? If I need to come up with an answer to how the universe began, I don't know. I don't know if it began and there was nothing before it. I don't think nothing can exist. So, really, I don't. I've heard that bubble universes, new universes popping into existence is another theory, but I don't have the answer to that. That does not make Dean's claim of a God doing it true. It doesn't. He brings up the second law of thermodynamics, but he forgets the law of conservation. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, but his entire argument is based on God did it. If we're really going to use science for this, then let's look at the science. We've seen a red shift when we are looking at the universe, and that means that as everything is currently expanding, we can shrink it all back. And if we shrink it all back, we can get to a singular point, and who knows what happens before that. But what can happen has to happen with time and with space. There has to be time for God to create a universe. There has to be stuff for God to create a universe with. There has to be a place for God to be. If there is no universe, there's nothing that's going to be creating it. It just makes zero sense. So, not convinced by the Kalam. The moral argument is a. The moral argument is a category error. When we talk about objective moral values, it seems to me like the idea that morality needs to be written in stone somewhere for it to be useful at all. The fact is, we create our values. We as a society are consistently changing. Go back 100 years. What were things like? Go back 1,000 years. What were things like? I used to think that the arc of history bends towards progress, but I'm not so sure anymore. But what I can tell you is that it changes. We as a society are always changing. Why is that so bad to recognize? This is not in a vacuum. We're not deciding how we should rule the world or how we should be nice to each other or why we should be nice to each other. We're being nice to each other. We are creating society. So the question isn't what should we do or why shouldn't we do it? It's what is happening right now. The question is, are we assuming that that if God wrote it in your heart, that we have a personal Jiminy Cricket, or that we as a society, through empathy and through community building, have done pretty good so far. I really hope that in 200 years, our future generations look back at us and go, man, that was awful what they did. They drove in cars by themselves. They ate meat, maybe, I don't know. But the fact is, it changes. To say that there are moral absolutes or that there are moral moral facts is wild. To be called an anti-realist is funny because I just don't buy that. I think that the idea that morals somehow exist in the ether out there is Platonism. So I would call that moral Platonism. If Dean wants to argue about morals, that's fine, but that is not the debate. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of it. You're right, I stumbled, I fumbled, and Dean, you had some really great points. We don't know a lot of different historical sources, and so we need to contextualize how much we value that, how much we judge that. If we don't know who an author is, it's important to at least check it against ones that we do know, see if there's a consensus, right? Cool. So let's compare it. When we take a look at they were trying to prove it was the Messiah. That's why you have a distinct difference between whether Jesus was in Nazareth or Bethlehem. It's why you have Jesus, after rising, a whole bunch of other people rising and walking through the streets. Do we really think that zombies walked through Jerusalem? Well, if you believe that what's in the book is true, I don't think so. If you check it against its peers, it doesn't come up that way. Do I care that if somebody was crucified? No, people were crucified by the Romans. Yes, that's the thing. Was there somebody named Jesus, an itinerant rabbi? Really don't care. I really don't care that there's a cookie jar or Chicago accent exists. I care that there's a unicorn that's being brought up as a reason. Empty tombs happen. We're not worried about the empty tomb, two miles away. So no, I really don't care. I care about a bodily resurrection, right? A bodily being lifted into heaven. And that's what we have to show. Dean had a really good example when it came to the Titanic, right? If some people said it snapped in half, other people said that it didn't. We need to evaluate what's possible. We can take a look after the fact, and we can see other ships that have sunk. We can run simulations. We can figure out that, okay, if that's large sinks, if it takes on that much water, it can crack in half. How many times have we seen people rise from the dead? How many times have we seen people ascend bodily to heaven? If you're a Christian, this probably isn't going to faze you, but the whole thing. If you're a Christian, it's probably not going to faze you that you've never seen or heard of other people dying and rising from the dead. But for some reason, Jesus gets a pass. And I don't know what I'm supposed to explain here. Do I need to explain why there's an empty tomb? No, don't care. Do I need to explain whether or not Jesus was crucified? I really don't know if there's enough evidence for it, to be honest. Outside accounts, outside of the Bible, there is not much on the ground in terms of contemporaries writing about the events. We have the testimony of Flavianus. Dean mentions that. But when we look, there are two places that mention Jesus in the testimony of Flavianus. One of them is widely by Christians and non-Christians alike recognized as fraudulent. That it was likely a scribal note that worked its way into the main text. The other one is someone named Yeshua that has nothing in common with anything else in the Bible. He's just mentioned somebody named Yeshua being executed. I don't think that's enough. Yeah. So let me just wrap this up. For the moral argument, it's a category error. You're not talking about physical things. Morality is not a physical thing that you can touch, that you can grab. Morality is not a place that I can take you. Morality is a concept that we all take part in. To treat it as a physical thing just doesn't make sense. Saying that there is objective morality like that is like saying that the number blue is a thing. It doesn't compute. So morality, cosmological argument, there's conservation of mass, doesn't get over that. And yeah, I really don't need to prove why the tomb is empty because I really don't care. I care whether or not somebody rose from the dead and was the Son of God, and we don't have enough to back that up. Thank you.
No, no. One second, sorry. I'm looking for it. Two minutes, right? Once again, in my opening speech, I made three arguments for the existence of the Christian God. The first being the cosmological argument that states whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. Therefore, God is the cause, and that God exists. Secondly, I argued for the moral argument on the basis of our moral behavior, and that moral anti-realism does not comport to our moral experiences. And then finally, I argued for the resurrection of Jesus Christ based upon agreed upon historical facts by scholars. Now, in his rebuttal, Eric said that this is just a too simplistic understanding of infinity. I would like to know from Eric, well, what does he mean by that? What does he mean it's too simplistic understanding of infinity? Is he talking about potential infinities, actual infinities, and which one of those can be instantiated in the actual universe, if at all? Secondly, Eric said, well, there are other models of the universe. And sure, there are other models of the universe. He mentioned the bubble universe. My question would be, what evidence empirically does he have for the bubble universe? If it's going to challenge the standard model that we understand through scientific data and observable experience. Notice in his rebuttal, he didn't argue against the causal principle. He didn't argue against that whatever begins to exist has a cause. He didn't argue against out of nothing comes. He didn't argue against that things don't come into existence uncaused from nothing. So if he's not going to argue against those or provide a plausible alternative, then does he accept the causal principle? And if he accepts the causal principle, then he has to explain the existence of the universe and it not being past infinite, or give us some explanation about infinity that comports and can be instantiated in reality as to undercut the kalam. He noted, he didn't say anything against the board use of the Lincoln theorem in his retort. He mentioned, the only thing he mentioned about the second law of thermodynamics is that I didn't mention the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy. Well, here's the thing that every single cosmologist understands about the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, is that law doesn't exist until the universe exists. So it applies in the universe, but not of the universe. If it applied to the universe, then the Big Bang standard model would be rejected by cosmologists across the country and across the world. So Eric has made a mistake there in saying that the law of conservation of energy, that matter is neither created nor is destroyed, applies to the universe because it only takes place in the universe. So it seems here essentially what Eric said with regards to the kalam is that it's a simplistic understanding of the universe. There are other models of universes like the bubble universe, other simplistic understanding of infinity. He didn't elaborate on that. He didn't elaborate on evidence for other models of the universe that undercut the standard model. And then also, he misstepped when he said that the law of conservation of energy applies to the universe, meaning it only exists and takes place and is applied in the universe. Moving to the moral argument, he said there was a category error. I failed to see what categories he was comparing and contrasting with regards to that. He simply said that we create our own values. And so by saying that, Eric has taken a moral anti-realist position. And so in doing so, what Eric says, we need to do things like build community. And he says things that our future people, future children and future people in our leaders will say, well, I hope they did X. Well, why? If moral facts of the matter don't exist, then why does it matter what we do in regards to morality? Why does it matter that we build community? It sounds like Eric is saying that these things do objectively matter. And I didn't argue in my opening speech that objective moral values and duties exist in some type of ether, right? Moral values and duties are properties of persons, and I argue that the best explanation for those properties' existence is not out in the ether, but actually in a personal moral lawgiver who gives moral laws that are demonstrated by moral facts that we all experience and know and understand. All right? And so Eric, when he talks about morality, then he shouldn't say, if he believes there are no facts of the matter, we kind of make our own morality, then he shouldn't say things like, something is wrong. He should simply say, something is, and leave it at that. Because that's what he said. We make our own values. And whether it's individually or societally, how do we adjudicate between what's right and what's wrong? If one full society says that it's wrong to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, and another society says that it's right to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, why does Eric believe that either one of those sides is wrong? Or is it just a matter of who holds the power in those individual governments? All Eric can say on a moral anti-realist position is that it just is. And to say that it just is does nothing to show that one side is right and one side is wrong. But if Eric does believe, whether he believes it's right to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people or wrong to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, if he says that it's wrong, then how does he get that on just it's a matter of what we are creating? And so obviously morality is not a physical thing. It's something that we experience as properties of persons, and the best explanation for those is moral facts that indicate moral laws. The best explanation for those is a moral lawgiver. Now, when we come to the resurrection, he talked about the consensus with regards to who wrote what. Well, that's interesting because the historical consensus about who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so he's going to have to provide another consensus that is just as plausible or more plausible than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if he's going to say that those are not the authors of the Gospels. He says, well, the contemporaries didn't mention particular things about the Gospels. And what I'd like to note, I don't know if I have it or not. What I'd like to note is that throughout history, and I might get into in cross-examination, that throughout history, a number of historians don't mention a number of things in their accounts that everybody views as historical, and I get to that in our cross-examination. He says, I'll give you everything up to the resurrection, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that he's given me all of those. But what Eric is doing, he says, well, we don't see people rise from the dead. It's not something that happens. Well, what Eric is doing is he's only restricting our background knowledge to the frequency of an event. For example, if we restrict our assessment of the probability that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon to mere frequencies, we would conclude that that event never happened. Think about it for a second. Let's say when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon that I was spelunking in a cave and I missed it. And I came out and said, what's all this hooping and hollering going on about this guy named Neil Armstrong? They said, well, he walked on the moon. Well, I would have to conclude that based upon frequency, people don't walk on the moon, right? But given the change in the background information, namely that the NASA space program, the technology available at the time, the U.S. pouring an equivalent of $250 billion into the Apollo project, it would change the background information to where it's not just a matter of frequency. These are not frequencies, but they are relevant to our background information. and knowledge that increases the moon's landing probability. Likewise, suppose we add only two pieces of the background information for Jesus' resurrection, that God exists, which I have argued for tonight, and that God wants to raise Jesus from the dead bodily, and that this comports to the religio-historical context surrounding Jesus' life. Well, in that case, the probability of the resurrection is 100%, even though we haven't touched the question of frequency. And so, given these situations, given Eric's inability to address the things that I've addressed, specifically laid out in the Kalam, with regards to the moral argument, the sources, and the resurrection, those three arguments still hold, and you should still consider that the God of Christianity exists, and you should become a Christian tonight.
Let me try this again. Thank you for that. You're right. You called me out on a couple of things that I just wasn't ready for. I should have been. So let's try this again. We have three ways. We have three tentpoles that hold up the way that we operate in the world. We have epistemology, which is the way you think. You have ontology, which is what is. And you have axiology. And that is the axioms that it's what ought. So you have what is, what ought, and how you come to your conclusions. Those are three distinct things. When we're talking about ethics and morals, those are oughts. Those are axioms. Those are not ises. And I mean, really, we can get into lots of other things like morality, right? Does justice exist? Does it exist absolutely? We all participate in something called justice, right? We try to. It's something that we strive to do, but it's not something that we can point out that's etched in stone. That's just not the case. Does it feel bad? Absolutely. Do I wish that I could say that there's a moral absolute out there that we can stand on and say this is how it just is? I absolutely wish we could, but that's just not the case. It hurts. But to use the argument that it feels bad, or to point out that it's just like my opinion, man, let's put that to the test. We do operate in a real world. How about you go and try it? If you really don't value human life and you don't think that it matters unless it's written in stone, right? Why don't you try it and see what happens? There are real world consequences. You don't need a God who's going to spank you in order for you to be a good person. You don't. How do I know? I don't do it out of fear of God, and I don't do it because God wrote it on my heart. To be honest, it's an assumption that really invalidates the experience of everyone else. You can do better than that. When you're talking about morality, how about you lend people the ability to be moral? Give them that. Don't make them have to argue about that. I think it's wild. When it comes to the cosmological argument, I'm glad that Dean brought up that you need time and space for the laws of thermodynamics to exist. It does not disinclude a God creating a universe. What exists outside of a universe? Is that even a rational question? Can anything exist outside of a universe? Is there an outside? If there is, what's there? Dean points at nothingness as the alternative. I don't think nothing actually exists. In any given space, there's something in it. So the pointing at nothingness just falls flat. And pointing at the Gospels and saying that the consensus is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Look it up when you get home. I think this is a wonderful example of it might seem that way, but when you do your scholarship, that's just not the case. I really don't need to be the one to tell you. You can go to other Christians, you can go to biblical scholars. It was not written by But okay, let's say it's anonymous, and we grant that. Cool. How much are we going to trust it? I believe that when an author is anonymous, you need to be more cautious. That's it. I absolutely did grant that. Okay, the Romans killed somebody. That person was crucified. I'm sure it happened a lot. Actually, it did happen a lot. Somebody was buried in a cave. I'm not at all concerned about that. If somebody rose bodily, that is in any way reasonable. What are some alternatives? Let's take a look at some alternatives. That Jesus was buried, or the person that story is attached to was buried away, and that's it. That could just be it. Legends grow because people need them. And the story that these early Christians were telling themselves needed that. It was something that they pushed back on and tried very hard to match Jewish prophecies. Isn't it more likely that legend is, because we know legends exist, couldn't it be more likely that a legend propagated this than supernatural intervention? Dean brings up the space program and Neil Armstrong. You know, if you were diving and came back up and somebody said a person landed on the moon, you are well within your rights to be like, that sounds crazy. That is nuts. What's going to convince you? How about looking at the evidence, right? We can send a person to the moon. Okay, where's the technology? We have the bills. Dean quoted a very large number that NASA spent to get us there. Cool, we can look at that. How many times have we replicated somebody being rising from the dead, ascending bodily into heaven? Right? We don't have evidence of that. So in the exact same way that it's perfectly rational for somebody to say, I don't believe a person landed on the moon until there's evidence, I think it's perfectly rational to say that a resurrection, as written in the Bible, did not happen until there's evidence. Simple as that. Let me see. Going back to the beginning, going back to what this debate is about, does the Christian God exist? I think we've quibbled about the cosmological argument, and it doesn't get us anywhere near a Christian God. I thought at the beginning, I believe it now. If the universe began to exist, the universe exists, therefore, all things begin to exist, the universe exists, therefore the universe began to exist. Cool. For purposes of this debate, fine. But to then say, and God did it, well, you're no longer in the argument. You're just attributing your deity to a very simple, it doesn't check out. Sure, universe, all things begin to exist, universe exists, therefore the universe began to exist, and my cat did it. Fantastic. Is that at all convincing to you? If that is not convincing to you, then why is it convincing when we say that God did it? It just doesn't check out. And the overwhelming consensus is not that a divine creator in any way was a part of this. If we're taking a look at the scientific reasoning around it, we get all the way to the point where we don't know, and then we use the amazing phrase, I don't know, for the rest. I don't know. That doesn't make you somehow lose an argument. What it does is it demonstrates intellectual honesty. I think it is intellectually honest for us to look at the origins of the universe and say, I don't know. And to claim otherwise means you have a burden of proof. And saying God did it is not enough. Demonstrate the same way that you demonstrated that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Wrapping this up, Dean points to the verses that I brought up and says, well, it doesn't matter what really matters. It doesn't matter if the waves were big or not. If you believe that the Bible is infallible, then that part was for you. If you think that not a single thing has changed in the Bible ever, and that it is perfect from beginning to end, that is for you. Because the first place to start is, no, it's not. It doesn't agree with itself, and it doesn't comport with reality. Moving forward from that, we have unreliable authors. We don't know who they are. They don't all match up with each other, and yet we're supposed to believe that an incredible event like that took place. How do we determine that? I think we need more than what we have. How about convincing, put this down. How about contemporaneous accounts written by Jesus? I would take that. That would be a lot better. We have written accounts of cult survivors who get out of the cult and still believe that the magical things that they saw their cult leader do, that they still happened. People can believe a lot of things. It doesn't mean that it's true. Can I wrap it up? Sure. I'm not going to argue against the veracity that terrorists, how much they believe when they commit acts of terror. When terrorists formed the Twin Towers, they believed it with all of their hearts. I'm sure it doesn't make it right. If the people who wrote this were very, very sure, cool. That still doesn't make it true. The fact that we've dated it and seen that it could not have been written by first-hand account, and in some cases admits straight out that they're not first-hand accounts, mean that it needs to be treated suspect.
We're now going to take a 5-minute break. We will begin promptly in 5 minutes.
I believe it's private money.
I don't know. I'm not sure I haven't studied it. I'll have to do it. What's up, friend? It's good to see you. I'm gonna press that. Like if you well, I'm gonna ask you. You say She's still bitter because she.
Watch out for the cord. I was just telling my husband I know 11 people here. We live on the beach now. Just here to support them. Quite well. Yeah, well, that's how living. I knew the first Sam, so I knew all of them before. Yeah. But I think a lot of these classes
All right. Check. 1, 2. Anybody hear me? Okay. I've never been accused of being quiet.
No. Yeah.
Just let me know when I've got. All right, so I'll go ahead and start with my 7 minutes. So Eric, in your opening, you had mentioned, or at least in your rebuttal, you had mentioned that when it comes to source material, we need to develop a consensus. My question is, my point that I made was that the historical consensus with regards to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you said, well, that's not the case. And then you said it's not up to you to do or to provide the information behind that. My question would be, why make that point if then you're not going to provide the information behind that? And second part of that is, what is the next best case for who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what's the historical attestation to those?
Sure. So the first piece, you're right. The thing is, in my time going through the historicity of the Bible, mostly Christian scholars that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And which ones were those? Which historical scholars have said that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have not written Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And why is their consensus? Is their consensus with? Well, yeah. I'll just ask that question. Who are some of those people?
Honestly, I can pull them up. Who gave you the consensus that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yeah. So church history would show that. So you have essentially all of Catholic history. You've got Papias, who says that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You've got Polycarp, who is a disciple of John, who also mentions John's writings. And so those are two things. But do you have those? I mean, we've only got 7 minutes, so if you've got some, we need to pull those out. If not, we can talk about that later.
I can pull them up a little bit.
Okay. So my other question would be about the source material. Is you say that these things are you think that these are historically unreliable?
So I think that when it comes to supernatural claims, we definitely need to hold anonymous texts we need to be skeptical of it.
So the question becomes with regards to these things. It seems like you're saying on one hand they're historically unreliable, but on the other hand you're willing to grant me things like the crucifixion, the burial narrative. You're willing to grant me that women saw the tomb empty, the disciples saw the tomb empty, the disciples believed that they had beliefs or experiences where they had that. So why is it that you're saying on one hand they are not historically reliable, but then on the other hand, in these other instances, they are historically reliable?
Sure, I'm picking the hill that I want to die on, Dean.
Okay, but the hill that you want to die on is
the one that's supernatural.
but it's not.
Is it? Hold on.
It's not directly connected to the resurrection.
Yeah,
right?
do you think that an empty tomb is just as likely to happen in a world as someone rising from the dead?
That depends on the background information.
No, anyone.
Right.
If you were to go to a graveyard and find an empty tomb, how high on the list is that person probably rose from the dead?
Well, I'm asking the questions. You can ask the questions there.
Okay.
Right. So the point that I'm asking or trying to get you or asking you about is, on what basis outside of this frequentist model of probability that you have that says just because it's never happened, it didn't happen. Why is that the case? I mean, you could make the same case about, like I said, about Neil Armstrong with walking on the moon. Prior to whenever he walked on the moon, nobody ever walked on the moon. And if you claim that he did and missed the event, you would say, oh, well, just based on frequency, that's not a thing.
Absolutely, and you would be justified in saying that until you evaluated the evidence.
Okay, so the evidence matters. So what we need to take into consideration with Jesus' resurrection is not some arbitrary empty tomb, but the religio historicity of who Jesus is and of who Jesus claimed to be.
Oh, got it. So you're pointing to the Jesus was God, therefore Jesus was God.
I'm pointing to the claims that Jesus made historically. That just about every scholar says that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher that went around and proclaimed certain things about himself.
Apocalyptic rabbis existed at the time.
All right. The second area I want to go to is the moral argument. So you said that we make the rules, and I laid out a piece about discrimination of the LGBTQ community. One society or person says yes, one society or person says no. On your view, do you think that there is a right or wrong answer to that question?
I think that I live in the context of a society that has actually recently changed its
That's
opinion. Let me answer.
Okay.
Sure. So I exist in a context, and really, honestly, the United States isn't even just, the United States hasn't fully decided. There's still lots of people who are very, very interested in committing violence against LGBT individuals. So hold on, but I don't live in Scandinavia. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, like, yes or no, it's wrong to discriminate against LGBTQ plus members.
Yes, it's wrong.
Okay, now, On a moral end, do you believe that as a fact, or is this just is something that you feel?
Neither.
Okay. All right. Okay. So then the last question I have about the Kalam argument. Why do you think that the Kalam, you've mentioned that the Kalam argument is just this, and this about the beginning of the universe, and God did it. But what do you do with the conclusion of the argument that is a inductive reference to something that is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, and personal?
Got it. None of those check out. Try me.
Well, okay. Explain to me why they don't check out.
Sure, absolutely. So let's start with powerful. Powerful is an incredibly subjective term. So what does it mean in this context? Does it mean able to create the universe? Is that all that means?
Well, I'm asking you a question. You tell me what it means.
No. So here's the thing.
Okay, that's not fair.
I kind of want to keep going. Can we keep going?
Well, you can just start your time.
Okay, fine. Starting my set. Ding.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, sure.
Powerful is contextual too, and there is not an absolute power. And so when you say powerful, it's poetry, sure. Personal, a personal God. Where do you get that from the Kalam? If you wanted to give William Lane Craig's version of that, sure. If you want to talk about timeless and spaceless, nothing can happen without time. If you say your God is timeless, that means your God, even if they existed, would be a statue, unable to move, unable to act, right? Because you need time for things to happen. You need time for causality. Spaceless, you need physical space for things to exist in. How can something exist that can cause things that is spaceless? There's my first question.
So what? That's a long first question. Which one? Okay, so how do you get something? Timeless simply means changeless, and philosophers of time have said that when it comes to the Kalam, it's perfectly logical for God to be timeless sans creation, and then everlasting inside of creation. So there's a point where God is changeless. Time is simply marking things that change. So just to say that God is timeless simply means that he's changeless.
Okay, so then how can God create anything that's changeless?
Well, based upon the Kalam, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. So as you evaluate, this is where the conclusion comes in. As you evaluate what could cause the universe to come into being, it can't be the universe in and of itself. There are no scientific laws that can operate off of initial conditions. So the only answer that's left is something that's personal.
Why personal? Hold on a second.
Because it only
Isn't it way more likely, seriously, if a deity existed that could create universes, and that deity poofed a universe and then died, you'd have a whole lot fewer things to prove, right? But you'd have a whole lot fewer miracles that need to be explained. You'd have a whole lot fewer.
Sorry.
No, that's a deist.
That's in the basis of the type of deity you're talking about. If you're talking about Zeus, then sure, Zeus could die off after he creates the universe.
So, and all of those are correct answers if you want to grant that. So let's grant the Kalam. You have a deity. How does that at all relate to the Christian God? The Kalam cosmological argument.
So the Kalam cosmological argument is simply part of a cumulative case for the Christian God. Notice my propositions tonight were that if God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, it necessarily follows that the Christian God does exist.
Yeah, if Christianity is true, then it follows that Christianity is true. That is a tautology.
No, that's not my argument. My argument is that if Christianity is true, the Christian God exists based upon
Christianity being true.
Based upon the resurrection of Jesus and the claims that he made.
Which is the claim of Christianity.
That's not a tautology. That is perfectly logically valid. That if it would be like me saying, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. If God exists and Christianity is true, it necessarily follows from those two things that the God of Christianity is
And I'm not saying your tautology doesn't check out in itself.
You can call it a tautology.
Yeah.
You could also call it logically valid.
No, if it's right, it's right. That's the point that you're making. And
You said 3 minutes.
yeah, the point of this debate is Christianity true? So if you're putting in that, if Christianity is true and this happened, the whole point is Christianity true? You're jumping the gun so that you can use it as evidence for your argument. Okay, I don't disagree there.
No, it's not. It's simply making
How about
two arguments.
Oh, okay. Now we're back
Your
on
time.
my time.
It's your
Cool. Okay. Let's get into the resurrection.
Okay.
Honestly, the books of the Bible. Dean, did John write John? Did Matthew write Matthew? Did Mark write Mark? Did Luke write Luke?
Yes.
Yes, they did. The apostles wrote
Okay,
the books of the Bible.
well, Luke's not an apostle. Luke's an associate of Paul.
Okay.
Mark is John Mark, who's an associate of Peter.
All right. So you're saying that they're first-hand accounts?
I believe that they're first hand accounts.
I thought we referred to them as, to be honest. Okay, that's fine. I'll put something out. But I guess I was expecting that you knew that we had anonymous authors for those books.
Well, the earliest manuscripts are anonymous. But well, it's not my turn to ask the question. So go for it. It's your time. Go ahead. We only have 3 minutes.
Sure. Dean?
I'm bracing myself.
I mean, where do we go? We talked about morality. Do you think that if morality is not given by a moral lawgiver, that is worthless?
I think it's subjective.
Do you think that it's worthless?
Worthless. That's a good question.
Because
I don't necessarily know that it would be worthless, but I don't know how you would be able to ground it or justify it.
okay, so one thing that I didn't bring up that I should have, so I'll use this as an opportunity. Dean, I will tell you.
You keep scaring me.
Objective is what happens when we come to an agreement on something as a goal. That is what an objective is. Board games have objectives. Sports has objectives. We can create objectives for ourselves. If we have an objective of moral, of human flourishing, well-being, in the elimination or at least the lessening of suffering, then you can have objective.
That's time.
So that makes it objective.
Okay. All right, so we've got.
Let's move to closing arguments.
All right, let's take a quick minute to get the podium back over here.
Do I need to take a restroom break? Go for it.
Sorry, I'm assuming the moderator's position. Where's the stand for So what did we have? 5?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
I'll use my phone. I'll just keep track. All right, in tonight's debate, I've made 3 arguments for the existence of the Christian God. The first being the Kalam cosmological argument, the second being the moral argument, and the third being the resurrection of Jesus. Now, in Eric's second rebuttal, and also in our cross-examination time, he had mentioned a multitude of possible or other gods that have been talked about as far as dying and rising gods. It should be noted that the vast majority of these gods are equated to agricultural cycles of the time. You should note that as far as P52 goes, he says that that's 135 years old. What's critical about P52 with regards to the Gospel of John is that it is the earliest fragment that we have, but it was found in Egypt. It wasn't found in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, or anywhere else the early church was at that time, which means that if something is found in Egypt between 115 and 135 AD, it means that it was circulated earlier than that, which makes John a younger document. In cross-examination, asked him about the sources. He has yet to give a counter-argument with regards to who the possible authors are of those sources. He doesn't, when it comes to empathy, with regards to morality, he mentioned early on that we should build society off of empathy. Well, here's a couple of reasons, here's a couple of questions that I would ask Eric if I had the opportunity. Is it that we judge what's good by our empathetic impulses, or do we judge our empathetic impulses by what's good? So he has to answer that. Horn, one of that would be we judge what's good by our empathetic impulses, but the problem with this is that it's deeply rooted in in-group bias, and that in-group bias will motivate actions in a way that we prefer to help or cooperate with people that we identify or perceive to be closer to us or more similar. So, for instance, on empathetic impulses, as you walk by a burning building, you may feel an empathetic impulse to help your wife survive from the fire, rather than the 150 people that are actually in the building. So, just on empathetic impulses alone, it shows that we are biased. But there are times where we agree that we need to overcome those empathetic biases to do what we believe, to do what is, we think that one ought to try and overcome these biases, that these impulses ought to be corrected. If we believe that, then we admit that the impulses itself are not good. All right? And so, as we close tonight, I want you to pay close attention to what's been argued, and note that essentially what Eric has argued tonight is an argument of, with the Kalam, it's just that God did it, but actually that's not the case. I haven't made that argument tonight. It's a logically deductive argument with the conclusion that is an inductive inference to the best explanation. The same is true for morality. Eric is a moral anti-realist. Notice in the cross-examination, he didn't answer the question whether he thought it was right with regards to the LGBTQ plus question. And then also when it comes to the sources and facts of the matter, when it comes to the resurrection, Eric seems to be arguing tonight, I like all the facts until it gets to the point where I don't like miracles. And then that's not a good reason to reject the resurrection. So, in conclusion, I've argued tonight that the Kalam cosmological argument provides an argument for the existence of God, that people are a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal, powerful being. I've argued for a moral lawgiver based upon the fact of our moral experiences and the fact that moral anti-realism does not comport to those moral experiences. And then I've argued for the resurrection. Notice, it has been fairly shocking that Eric has given away so many points with regards to the resurrection. I don't have time to go through all those. But at the end of the day, the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument, and the argument for the resurrection of Jesus is good grounding for people to believe that the Christian God does exist. Eric has not defeated those arguments. He's, in my opinion, he's barely raised his own arguments, and for that reason, tonight, for those who are watching and for those who are in the audience, you should not just consider becoming a Christian, you should be a Christian. Amen, and to God be the glory.
I want to start by saying thank you to Piedmont Church. Thank you to Longwood University. Thank you to Dean. This has been enlightening, hasn't it? So, are you keeping time?
He's got it.
I really didn't raise too many objections against it, because really a lot of that stuff just doesn't matter when it comes to the topic of the debate. That's great that Dean wants to talk about the Kalam cosmological argument. That has nothing to do with the Christian God. Is it deductive to say, okay, if you want to get to the universe having a beginning, sure. But Dean made zero case that he has any idea what happened there, whether it created itself, whether there was something before it that set it off. We don't know. And yeah, that is a real answer. We don't know. The only thing that you have is an assertion that comes after a logical argument. The logical argument getting all the way up until the universe having a beginning. And even then, I don't know that. But to say that a God did it, that was never presented tonight. Dean did not present that tonight. When it comes to morality, Dean brings up examples of the LGBTQIA plus community, and if we were to discriminate, would that be a bad thing? Yes. Does it need to be written in stone? It didn't seem to be written in stone 50 years ago when we were fighting for it. It didn't seem to be written in stone 20 years ago when we were fighting for it. And in a lot of places, it's still not written in stone because we are fighting for it. To say that objective moral truths exist that way does not take into account reality, and did not take that into the real world. When it comes to the Bible, yeah, no, I'm going to be absolutely honest. Do I think that people dying is a spectacular claim? No. Do I think that an empty tomb is a spectacular claim? No. But it's not just it goes until I don't like it. It goes up until it breaks breaks reality. When you get into magic, that's when you really need to start proving evidence of magic. And resurrection from the dead is fundamentally different from an empty tomb. It's fundamentally different from normal things, right? I brought up at the beginning, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar? And we can get all the way up to the point where until we assert magic, and that's just, I just don't understand how Dean has not figured that those are different. I really don't. I hope as an audience you have. I hope that I've been able to point out that the verses, there are conflicting verses in the New Testament in the books of the Bible. I did not bring names for some sources, and I absolutely should have, but I encourage you to do some research on your own. Do I think that Dean proved that the Christian God exists? I do not. And I don't think you should either. I think what you should do is look into the stuff that I pointed out to you. You should look into why there are inconsistencies in the New Testament. Why there is so much debate about the authorship of these books. You should absolutely look into moral philosophy, how we speak to each other, how we interact, and how we come up with moral odds. It's not as simple as to say that it was just handed to us. It's we should be proud of. And to write it off as something that was given to us is just, I don't even have words. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I really do hope you spend the time and look into this, and I hope this is an enlightening and at least educating or entertaining debate. And thank you very much.
We are now going to have a brief time of Q&A. I will say as a reminder that this is a time of question and answer, not a question of opinion, with a question mark put on the end and answer. If you're going to ask a question, please make sure it is respectful, and please make sure that it is indeed a question. Make sure you specify who you are asking, and if it's both, make sure to specify that as well. Yes.
Is there any, I don't know if there's any questions on the live stream, you're more than welcome to ask as well. Are you here in the room? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Can you give me some information about who started this debate? I mean, who set it up and what organization is behind it, and where are you from? How did you get to your position? How did they get you to be the opposite speaker for Dean?
Well, I'll answer the question about how this happened. This actually happened about 5 years ago. I was going out to Dripping Springs, Texas, to do a Discipleship University presentation on classical arguments for God, and I didn't have a place to stay. So I knew Eric was living in Austin, and I had incessantly harassed Eric and his co-host on Talk Eden by calling in. And so I just randomly Facebook messaged Eric, like I called him video feed, and I said, hey, I need a place to stay. Can I stay at your place? And he was like, yes. So the first time that he and I ever met face to face was me coming down the escalator in Austin. And then I did a presentation, then went over to the atheist community of Austin and talked with those guys and hung out. And we've been great friends ever since. And so when the opportunity came and Josh asked me, if I would be willing to do a debate here, sponsored by Piedmont, I said, yeah, under one condition. And then he was like, what? It's like, I want to pick the dance partner because I don't want to sit and just be in a massive firefight or wrestle with pigs. I want to be with somebody that's going to be cordial and be respectful. And the first person that came to my mind was Eric Murphy. So that's how that came about.
Austin, Texas?
Yeah, he was living in Austin at the time. So
The boots are a giveaway.
you got anything that you want to add?
Yeah, the first time we actually hung out, you were going to go sleep on my couch, wasn't it?
Yes, and then Eric had said something about William Lane Craig, who's my philosophical idol. And so then we stayed up and talked till like 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah, you had included existing as a quality of God, and I lost it.
Oh yeah. And then after that we did a recording for like 2 hours in your studio.
We did.
Then I got 2 hours of sleep and went and did my thing and then go over to the church.
Yeah. And just in the time since, keeping in touch with each other, getting to know each other's families, and really wanting to emphasize that the best approach should be one that is empathetic, the best approach should be one that is empathetic. I don't understand what this is.
Yeah, sure. Can we get these out of the way? And I'll set the stand. I just looked at the camera like, Eric, there's an audible voice and no Eric. Does that count?
One way you recognize the humanity in your interlocutor, and hopefully, go into things with an open mind. And you just don't see it nowadays. You see way too many people pointing fingers, calling names, and
just real quick on that. It's not just a model for a debate. Right? We live in a society right now where it's just the norm to be visceral and divisive and at each other's throat. And one of the goals that we had with this was to show that as big of a disagreement as this is, we can still have cordial conversations with each other because we care about each other. And so that's part of the reason why we want to do this. Great question, by the way. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi. Question over here. This is directed at Eric. When you were speaking, I think initially you mentioned that a particular verse was widely accepted by Christian and non-Christian scholars to be not part of the biblical canon, and I was wondering if you could tell me about that.
Sure. Why did you do that? I'm just kidding.
I have my apologetics.
It's all good. It's all good.
I have my apologetics study Bible here, actually. And funny thing is, it points a lot of them out for me. So I know one of the things that I brought up was the testimony of Flavianum, which actually is not in the Bible. It is in the writings of Flavius Josephus, who was a contemporary at the time. He wrote a lot. He wrote so much about what was going on at the time. He wrote about when you should change your sandals, like that. And you would expect that as he's writing about the comings and goings of the area, which is where it all took place, he would write about Jesus Christ and the apostles and the miracles and the healings and the resurrection. Like that would probably come up. And at one point, there's a very famous section called the Testimony of Flavianum, and that is widely regarded as something that was a margin note by a later scribe who was copying it down, and it just got worked into the text, partially because of anachronisms, ways that it was described that were not consistent with the way people spoke back then. And so, if you were to read something that said, man, this person had Riz, but it was in the 80s, you'd be like, Riz is not a term that people used back then, and it's kind of like that. That's also how we're able to determine quite a few passages. Dean, if you take this for a second, doing this with one hand is rough.
I got you, bro.
Thank you.
Well, can I add to that? This may help you. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 5, there was an added section there that says, even we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. And then in parentheses, which means it was not in the original text, by grace you have been saved. Does it change what was said before? So that wasn't in the original text. It was added, but it did not change the meaning of it. It does do any of the added sections that you're talking about change the meaning of the text.
Is that a question?
No,
I'm just kidding.
He's helping out.
I got you. No.
Okay, so at the end of Mark, we generally say that Mark ended at 16:8, but there are versions that have more text. You have Mark all the way up to 19, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. That you have driving out of demons, and just a few adventures of Jesus that not just non-believers, but even Christian historical scholars have this does not match the writing style. This might have just out of place, out of time things to it, and so yeah. But yeah, I mean the Christian and non-Christian scholars have agreed on places
I would agree that at least in Mark 16, and I'm a self-proclaimed outlier on this. There's been a discussion for a while about the ending of Mark. I personally don't know that the ending of Mark, the long ending of Mark, is what it is. I don't think that it is in the earliest manuscripts. But even then, you see at the end of that section, it ends at 8. You still have, the women being told to go talk to Peter, and Peter tell Peter to go. I forget where it is, Galilee, or Jesus. So I don't think that's an issue. A lot of times, people will adopt Mark 16 or 9 through the end of the book because of some theological reason. And I don't think adopting texts that are in contention just because they serve your theological point is a good idea. So, good question.
And according to the Apologetic Study Bible, it's normally taken out because the earliest versions of Mark don't have it at all.
Which version? Which study Bible? Apologetic Study Bible? I mean, I don't know. No, if you're going to say something that causes me trouble, I'm just going to say, well, just forget that one.
No, you're gonna.
No, I'm just kidding. Just don't go by that.
Do you have an Amazon link to that apologetics Bible?
I honestly, I bought it at a Christian bookstore.
Anything else?
You got me.
Abe, you're doing a great job. Actually, before that, can we give a round of applause for Abe? Just go in beast mode tonight. I'm passing a suitcase.
This question is directed at both of you. In my research and study, I've always wanted to look at the historical reliability. So I looked at the fragments that were out there, and then the sheer number of fragments and scrolls that are presented that we have physically now outnumber every other text out there. How, if historically reliable that the Bible exists and the God of the Bible exists, how do you discount all those fragments that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually pretty easy. When the Dark Ages happened, you have a point in time when leadership was Christian.
Turn it back on. Turn it back on.
Yeah, sure. You have a point in time when leadership was Christian, and you have purges of manuscripts. There are a lot of critics of early Christianity who were just wiped out, and we only know them because they were referenced by somebody else, and that didn't get burned down. There were different versions of and different sects of early Christianity that didn't know which way to go, and what was settled on was what was kept. Heretical texts have been burned for a very, very, very long time. And to say, well, this exists, but there are no peers, well, we did that. we absolutely did that. So does that clear that out?
It's just what we still have, not the ones that were burned. Just
Yeah, we don't have the ones that were burned. You're right.
of course.
So to talk about manuscripts of texts, it does. This is a key point that I think as Christians we need to be very careful about. Just because we have a lot of something doesn't make it true. We have a lot of books by J.K. Rowling that talk about a wizard, right? It doesn't mean that that's true. What we want to do is we want to take, now the sheer volume is impressive, like over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. When you talk about other languages that the Bible is translated into, you get something like 25,000 manuscripts total. Now, that's a lot, but what we want to do is we want to ask the question, two questions. How have they been translated? or excuse me, how have they been transmitted, right? How have they been passed down? And then what's in them, and then the question becomes, based upon what's in them, is that stuff historically reliable? So for example, if, for instance, you had one Isaiah scroll that was 500 years BC, and you had another Isaiah scroll that was 500 AD, what you could do is you could take those two texts and essentially lay them over top of one another and ask the question, how much has changed between the BC scroll and the AD scroll? And that helps answer the question about transmission, right? But transmission does not equal historical reliability. Everybody following with that? So I hear a lot of times Christians say, well, because we have a bunch of them and they're accurate, they've been accurately transmitted, therefore they're true. Well, you still need one more step. You need to look into those and ask the question, okay, what in here is historically reliable? So I think that's the point that Eric is getting at. And sure, did the Catholic Church burn a bunch of stuff? Yeah. Protestants burn a bunch of stuff? Yeah. The question, the only point that I would push back on Eric, this might start a whole other thing, maybe for another time, would be that in Colossians chapter 4, at the very end, Paul tells the church to read the scroll that's coming from Laodicea and then to send the Colossian letter to the Laodiceans. Peter, or for the sake of Eric's position, I will say, the author who wrote 1st and 2nd Peter says that Paul's stuff is hard to understand, is essentially what he says. Well, how does he know that? Well, he has access to what Paul wrote. So what we have just in the internal evidence is that there is evidence that these things were circulated between Christians early. That doesn't discount the councils that have taken place. That doesn't discount the prejudices that have taken place. So we need to be cognizant of all of that before we go off and run to our atheist friend and say, there's a whole lot of these, therefore it's true. Right? Because they'll just come back and say, there's a whole lot of Harry Potter. Right? So yeah.
Do we have live stream questions?
Yes. Okay, there's a live stream question.
If you want to look it up, it's in Latin. Argumentum ad populum, argument by popularity.
Right.
This question is from Josh Peters. The Christian God is Trinitarian is not a feature of the inductive argument to the best explanation of the cause of the beginning of the universe. This is for Dean.
Okay.
Nor is it a feature of the moral argument as presented. Further, a strictly Unitarian God could have raised Jesus from the dead. Until the Trinity makes an appearance, the Christian God has not been proved. Does Dean think the Kalam, moral, and resurrection arguments require the Trinity? If so, why has it been absent? If not, have you lost the debate?
It's a whole lot right there. Could you repeat the question? There's a whole lot. So the question becomes, so I'll answer it this way. I don't think that, I don't necessarily know that the Trinity needs to make an appearance in this specific debate, because if you look at the religio-historical background, Jesus himself claims particular things about him and about the Father and about the Spirit. And so if Jesus was raised from the dead and he made claims about himself that are also entailed with God the Father and God the Spirit, then it seems that Christianity would be true. And so the question that I would ask would be, does the questioner have any evidence from the text it seems like he's arguing from the text of Scripture, that the Unitarian God that he proposes is more probable based on a scriptural examination of the Trinitarian God that many Christians propose. So,
All right, hold on.
no.
Have you looked at the probability of that? Have you done that math?
Yeah.
Which is more likely, a Trinitarian God or a non-Trinitarian God?
Based upon the examination of Scripture.
Yeah.
My argument was based upon the examination of Scripture. On the basis of the examination of Scripture, there's clearly. Yes, I have. There's no mention of the Unitarian God in at least as you're talking about like the claims of Jesus. You look at the earliest source material behind Jesus' life. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I mean, Jesus in his passion narrative mentions both of those, the Father and the Spirit. So he doesn't. It doesn't seem to be in the narratives about Jesus' life and the religio-historical context that he exists in that he has in mind a Unitarian God.
Okay, so there you go.
Have you done that?
Yes, I have. And here's the conclusion that I came to, is each claim needs to be evaluated on its own, right? If I made 3 true statements, is that why?
Yeah.
If I made 3 true statements and then lied about the 4th statement, just because the first 3 were true, does not make the 4th one more likely true, right? So to say, oh, well, we believe that Jesus did this, and so when he says this, he's more likely not lying, or it's true, you have now just completely disregarded the work that you're going to need to do to find out whether or not that statement is also true. Unless it's either where are you getting that? It just surprises me. Yeah.
No, the question at hand is, as you observe and study the earliest source material behind Jesus, and you ask the question, is it more probable that Jesus himself believes in a Unitarian God, or let me rephrase that. On the basis of examining Scripture, what's more probable, a Unitarian God or a Trinitarian God? Just on the basis of examining what the text says, you get a Trinitarian God is more plausible than a Unitarian God. That's the only claim that I'm making.
And then one other.
You got the last word on this one.
Yeah.
Another question.
One other piece of that is I've talked to Christians who said that they're non-Trinitarian, and if you are non-Trinitarian Christian, then if I'm arguing the existence of Christianity, it's still going to be there. I mean, there are some really weird Christians out there who believe all kinds of stuff. Mormons call themselves Christians. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves Christians. And if I were to have a debate with them, about their Christianity, I wouldn't gatekeep them out of it because of a Trinity issue.
Now I want the last word. Go ahead.
I have a question for Eric.
Yeah.
For you personally or other atheists, if there is no death, burial, and resurrection, do you sin? And if you do sin, do you have any forgiveness of that sin? And on the day that you draw your last breath, is there a heaven or hell, or is that just it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, no, I think that sin is a blood curse that comes from Genesis. It is a really weird idea, and I think it anthropomorphizes concepts that, I don't believe in sin. I don't think you need to have a concept of sin to be a good person, and I don't think a fear of hell should in any way be the deciding factor about whether or not you do good or bad things. I think that when it comes to heaven and hell, no. So what makes you you, right? What makes you the person that you are? Because
everything that I've seen, it comes from a brain, it comes from having a spinal cord, right? It comes from having a central nervous system. If we look at people who experience traumatic brain injuries, and they've had drastic changes to their personalities, because that is where you live. You live in here. And between this and your gut bacteria and the rest of your central nervous system, there's nothing left. I don't think there would be anything that could go to heaven. I mean, so if we were to rule that out, right? If we took away the happy chemicals in your brain, are those going with you to heaven? Are you able to be happy without them? Your memories, the story that you tell about yourself to yourself, that all exists in meat space. There's no evidence of a soul existing, and if it did, what would it be? And then that doesn't even get me onto the idea of heaven and hell, because heaven and hell, I think, is truly, truly horrific. The idea of eternal life is one of the most unimaginable nightmares that I could imagine, be it heaven or hell.
Now just remember, when Eric says things like good, bad, horrific, those are just ises, they're not oughts. They're not objectively true.
Okay.
They're just ises as meat robots. So, there you go.
For a second time, I think we should go on to the last question.
Okay. You got the last word in the other one, I got that one.
Yeah, my question at first was initially for Mr. Murphy, but I suppose it's also applicable to both people. It's kind of a two-part question. The first part is yes or no, do you believe in objective morality? Resolve that.
Yeah, we create the objectives.
Yeah. Okay. Second part is, with that in mind, is it morally better to bake a pie for a widow than it is to kick a baby in the face?
It is morally better to bake a pie for a widow.
Okay. I guess that would be how, but I've already asked my two-part question. So
Yeah,
I'll leave that.
I can
Yeah.
go from there.
Yeah.
I can go from there.
Did you say it's morally better to make a pie for a widow than kick a baby?
Yes, yes, it is.
No, did you say that?
No, I said it is morally better to make a pie for a widow than it is to kick a baby.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
So morality is a whole lot more complex than the very simplistic, childish version of morality that I'm saying this is wrong.
I know.
So
brothers.
Yeah. So here's the thing. You have things called mirror neurons, right? Those mirror neurons go off when you see somebody else experiencing pain. The closer they resemble you, the more those neurons will go off. Being able to feel each other's pain, those empathetic beginnings are completely biological, and there's an evolutionary advantage to that. The advantage is that you're able to help each other in a social species, right? And as you get growing social species, they develop mores and they develop ways that they interact. It's the development of a culture, and that culture defines itself and changes over time, right? If we all kicked babies, we wouldn't be around anymore. And I think that the people who would rather kick a baby didn't have kids and probably didn't pass on as many proclivities to kick babies, right? I think you can come to absolutely naturalistic explanations for those things. And when it's not biological, it's sociological. Sociology is an actual thing, right? The way we treat each other, the stories that we create for ourselves and for the society around us have everything to do, and is constantly changing. So with the example of the LGBTQ community, they didn't always have rights, and people didn't always treat them like they should. That's changing, and that's fantastic, right? And it's happening with trans people, right? They deserve to be treated with compassion, kindness, respect, and to be treated just the way anybody else is treated, right? We're working on that, but we're in the process of that. The idea that there are set in stone moral dictates flies in the face of the reality of what I have just described to you. Yeah. So that's where it comes from. right? It's the mess around and find out answer, right? Like if you want to do something like that today, go ahead and try it. You know, the play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Like you can try, go for it, but you're going to come across the reality that we have worked together to build a moral framework that we're evolving and changing and growing.
I'll just say this one. Doesn't the mess around and find out imply that there's a moral standard that should X happen and you find out it's because you've done something that's wrong, or not just is? And then the other question I would have would be, you said it's biological. If we are simply spin-offs of biological evolution, then what obligation do I have to treat people with dignity or respect when actually it may be advantageous to not do that? So for instance, when you're on a safari and we all say that the lion killed the zebra, but the lion didn't murder the zebra, right? We see on Discovery Channel for Shark Week, we see one shark forcibly copulate with another shark. We don't say that the shark raped the other shark, it just forcibly copulated with it, right? And so the safari guide doesn't look at the lion and say, well, Mr. Lion, you have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. But that wouldn't work if I decided to bust down somebody else's door and do that. No, there's no way on the face of the earth that I could, that if I did actually rape somebody, I could not stand before the judge and say, I just acted like a shark. That wouldn't work.
No, it wouldn't.
So I'll let you have last word, because I think we're over time.
Okay, so what part of we created the system and we're acting it out? It's something we're taking part in together, right? You do one of those things. You're talking about something against the law, and
Whose law?
Ours. You know, the one that's actually going to arrest you, Dean. And you know what? All of that is secular, isn't it? And I don't agree with it because I think that cops are just a lot of work to do in our system. We've got a lot of work that we need to do, but still, we are trying to legislate our morals, and that is human. That is human, unless you want a theocracy, right? If you want a God leader who's going to hand down their dictates, that speaks to God or is the mouthpiece of God, then okay, that would play out. But we do live in a democracy where we as humans have got together and decided what those laws are and legislated that. Mess around and find out that what I'm saying there is you're going to bounce up against the very real consequences that we have decided will happen if you do something like that. On top of that, hold on. On top of that, if you went and did that, do you think you would be accepted in society? Do you think that you would continue to be a part of that society? Come on, Dean. Are you going to live in a bubble here? Yeah, is that a question? That's a question. Would you be allowed to continue to be a part of a society if you raped or murdered people willy-nilly? Like, is that something that you would be able to do? Because as a social creature, you kind of need that, right? You kind of need social cohesion.
No, I agree with you.
Oh, so then why?
Wait, whoa.
Why
You
did you
finish
fail?
the answer.
Yeah.
I agree with you that I would be cast out amongst the society, but there's no reason why on morality simply being biological. You may have a social herd morality that's forced upon people, but that doesn't give any other reason for things being right and wrong. It's just what is in order to survive and not be cast out of the herd.
The funny thing is that kind of matches reality, doesn't it, Dave?
No.
Yes,
It doesn't.
absolutely. We see herd mentality going into the past. We've done some really weird stuff, and we have changed and evolved into it. I don't. What? And also sharks.
On behalf of myself, Eric, I want to thank you guys for coming, everybody that's on the opportunity for those of you who are interested tomorrow at Piedmont Church of Christ. I am doing the Bible class and the sermon, but also I really do want to thank Eric, who's like a brother. I'll tell you this last story. After my dad passed away in October, Eric is one of the first 3 people that I called, because that's how much I care for him and I love him, and I know that he loves me the same. And also, would you please, just for the sake of me, give Eric a round of applause for coming into this. And giving us reasons why he believes what he believes. So with that, thank you guys for being here tonight. We are dismissed. Or did you have something? Oh, you just all right. Thank you guys. It's supposed to start raining in 15 minutes, is what I've been told. So if you don't have your Patagonia, you need to roll out. Well, 2020, what happened? Oh my God. Thank you guys so much. Y'all driving back easy. No, listen, what's happening? Biggest this guy who was sacrificed all the things. So have all of I bet what is it after? You got to have one more right? I mean put on the fire. The biggest hole yeah, I see the friend of mine. I've been every time that was actually one of the that's the first
I have forgotten how long it was.
And then I'll also send you
Yeah.
just the website.
On the internet.
Yeah, if you call, our church number is still the same. I don't know if it's. I can't look it up. It is on. Josh, do you have any business cards? I put them in your wallet.
See ya. Yeah. Right. I will keep you all you guys go. Thank you so much. So you're going to y'all are going to your house? Yes. What, are you gonna go to the yeah, so 1600.
Okay.
No, because you want Eric. You like Eric. Oh, this is
What? I gave him the card. Josh,
you know.
No way. Paul, when he was stoned to death, in Acts 14,
Get out on Friday, come back to the Riverwalk. We have a funny recourse story.
He had a rap at one, as the train that's, also the first Thessalonians, the rapture, you have to
Getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Wait, get these up?
But Paul says, as we see the day approaching, that means when we see it happening, we are getting closer. He's not down in context, he's not watching as far as I'm concerned. As far as destruction, Asian politics, destruction, they're demonizing us, is what I'm trying to say. Russia is demonizing the West. That's a sign we're getting ready to attack.
One of the I couldn't tell if that camera was on. You turned it off. You turned it off. Well, I turned that one. Oh, yeah, that comes across. Even though it's still.
And I'm saying that Russia is crazy.
Yeah, it's not recorded.
But it's not recorded.
And we were saying, so therefore we have to destroy them. That's the logic of the Russian argument. And, I'm thinking it's gonna happen.
Can you open the door and probably this side?
Well,
you should have seen him a couple of years ago.
I went to the Methodist church back in 2005, and I got up and said, within like 2 days, I was very fast, so I never did that again. And on the other side, you're on the other side.
That's right.
And the main thing to remember, besides the idea that what Christ comes to try to find, how does he come? He appears in the sky, and he gets the Russian soldiers to go over to his side, and sends them home to Russia, and they're the ones that overthrow the Russian government. So he gets credit as the savior, and they're the ones that do the work. And that helps Russia because the world will hate the Russians. Because when they overthrow the Antichrist, the world will love the Russians. Overthrow the Antichrist. Are you a student here?
Oh, no, I'm visiting.
And you're
Another 2 hours, 4 hours.
another 4.
Yes.
So you're a student here? Well, if these things don't happen, I want to tell people that, tribulation may just be 5 months. You don't have to say that you know it. Maybe it's 5 months. And that would be the amazing thing is that this is a tremendous burden on people's shoulders.
It's also the first 3.5 years being almost like a state of peace, and the last 3.5 being political.
That's what, you know,
That's one of your, at least now, from some biblical scholars. People just feel where exactly
thanks so much for calling me if you have any comments.
Oh, of course.
Thanks for coming, sir.
Thank you. You're the pastor of the church that sponsored it.
I preached over there. Yeah.
Maybe you're I went through that church a few years ago.
Did you? You should come back and see us sometime.
Jerry was there.
Jerry Sawyer.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know him. Yeah, that's 9 years ago.
Time flies.
Sure does.
And, I'll call you.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks so much for.
Yes, sir. Glad you come.
Oh, well, this is a preview of what I want to talk about. I was telling the other fellow that I believe that tribulation will only be 5 months long, won't be 7 years later. How it is.
Oh, there's all kinds of beliefs about tribulation. I'll just sit down and open up the Bible with some churches. Coming over to the office and we'll look at what the Bible says.
Come over to the church going, yes.
Yeah.
Right, so that would be
Put it up and
evolution
see what we find.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
is like
actually,
your appendix. We don't do that anymore. So working on appendixes were no longer something that was going to determine whether or not you were going to pass on our genes. And eventually, it just became what it is now. That's evidence of evolution. But are there, is there something else about evolution you disagree with? Okay, so the other cool thing about evolution is, like look up TikTok. TikTok. It is, you know, this we have so many. TikTok's the one that gets us from water to land. It's incredible. I mean, just the evolution alone is this weird phenomenon.
Is it because of the anatomy? No, because I made that one.
So
I can tell you made that.
did not.
It literally got all the numbers.
He did say that. So, like, I got five completely Isn't that wild? 3 or 4 different evolutionary trees that converge in crabs. You knew about that? What? Apparently crab, it works. Like, it's such a cool study. Listen to people way smarter than we are. Oh my gosh. Make your eyes pop open and hopefully it makes you reevaluate what you're. Yeah?
Oh, I'll tell you about the part. Okay. We don't agree with it. Okay. Yeah. But there's a lot of ground cover.
It's great though.
I can bring him to your house. I can bring him to your house.
Oh, he's got a car. We've been talking about whether he can find his way from there.
Oh.
Feel bad because Kristen called me or left me a note.
He did connect on Facebook. I was teasing at that sound question, but that guy.
I actually don't know where it went.
Well, or his mom did. It said Patricia,
Yeah.
but that should be him.
it doesn't count.
Yeah.
If you think you want the subjective, I'm not putting the seats that wasn't there before.
Okay.
And in time,
Except for the Mayberries. No, they'll take care of themselves. Yeah. Yes. Oh, thank you. So there it is. Oh, trust me. So, does that clarify a little bit better than how I did on stage? Oh, no, it does.
Yeah?
I think so.
What's up, dude?
Yes.
Reach out.
He's the friendly ambassador for psychology for
You what?
they gave her the title psychology ambassador.
No shit. Congratulations, man. That's awesome.
Just took a year of straight A's and now another year, and then grad school.
I am so excited to see what is in your I'm so excited to see what's in.
And do you remember that little thing that we talked about with the Lord?
Yeah.
So,
Legend.
and legend. So I did some thinking, and I came up with a better, and I feel like arguing about the religion part.
Yeah.
Because not like that's not really the point. So we me and a few other people we came up with delusional thoughts. Delusional intrusive thoughts.
Delusional intrusive thoughts are absolutely a thing. But here's the thing. Like, what is rational?
See, that's what we also give you some thought about.
Right. So rational is something that is rational and it's internally consistent with the way you understand the world. Right? If you think that that eggs fall from the sky every once in a while and one hits the roof of your car, you're not going to think somebody threw it. You're going to think, oh, that just happens from time to time, and you're rational in thinking that. Are you right? No. People can be convinced wrong things. It doesn't mean that they're delusional. It just means that they don't have all the evidence or they.
That's why it's difficult to establish a law in society.
What is?
So, my question is, we're gonna bring the white part around, so it's 15-minute program.
It is.
So we're bringing white part around.
Yes, you need to. Where's the merch?
No, I'll bring that one.
You can make it.
Oh, Dave, I thought you said Dave, I'm like,
I thought you said Dave too.
no, right there.
Okay. We can go.
Oh,
Is that
okay, we're bringing the car.
So we'll just work you up. We'll work you right out of here. That's yours.
Are we doing that? What's that called?
Oh.
Hey, Eric.
Yes.
No, not you.
Gotcha.
Bye, Eric.
I don't want to.
You want to take a picture?
That's why I'm saying.
Yes. Want to take a picture with everybody?
I don't want to mess this up.
Want to get in your team?
Sure, yeah.
Go on, guys.
Okay.
Yes. Gotta memorialize.
I'm behind your big head.
Gotta engrave this in stone. Oh, how am I gonna do this? There we go.
Alright, that's a lot, dude.
Hey, he's gotta make sure.
What's the unique couple?
All right. Very nice seeing both of you. Have a great rest of your day. Safe travels back.
Alright.
So Eric, you were sanctioning out the waves of the lake, Tiberius, not waves of the sea. Has someone tested this and, and kept, track of the height of the waves and sort of thing, about.
Yeah. I'm gonna give him a right. You ready to go?
All right. Now, what were you saying?
That's great. You're great, Jack. I really enjoyed it. No, not in that way.
Yeah, no.
Not at all. I'm gonna be watching your videos.
Hey, have you heard about the strata porn, how they did a computer enhancement of the shoulder?
And there's a face on it?
On the body, and they found.
Oh, well,
where
you're
one
gonna
of
sway
those-
anybody.
So actually, when the rest of the leather is wrapped.
No, I haven't.
They found a little box with a little stretcher in it.
No, I haven't.
What I read, that's, and it's, what's enhancement,
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And I thought that was worth passing on. In other words, he was a Jew too.
Oh, okay, yeah. This is it, I guess this is mine.
Well, I've watched lots of debates, and I've never gone in thinking, okay, this debate is gonna change everybody's mind. No, it's not a good call, but you at least hope that people will. I appreciated your take, and I had a lot of questions there at the end, but I wasn't gonna monopolize.
You can get my number from Dean and call me anytime.
Yeah, that's
Well,
what I
when you
hear.
said that,
About,
I think about this,
inerrancy, it doesn't have to be inerrant.
I could get your answer and your take, but
That's
if you
something like, God's purpose for it to be happen.
I don't know.
And what I do is I take the statement, when he says, I came to fulfill the law, which you expand that to fulfill the Bible, the word fulfill should mean, complete or to make inerrant, from a state of errant, of being errant. And, in other words, it's correct.
Right.
And I'm in the same way.
No, just get my stuff together.
There is, when he actually, does a
True stuff. Yeah,
don't. Scripture where, the passage where it says Moses gave us angel bread or angel food. And, gave us the bread.
True.
Yes.
And he says, no, Moses did not give you bread, I'm the bread. And, so he makes a correction. The same thing is true with,
Yeah, well, in our day-to-day, we generally talk more to Christians than we do atheists. So it's good to